Erasmus Crane and the Cthulhu Murders, a short horror story, written by Michael Vandervoort, narrated by Robin Reads. It was the early morning, at around 5 a.m., that I stepped down from the hansom cab and into the swirling murk of pre-dawn rain. Around me, the jaundiced glow of the gaslights offered a valiant but ultimately futile effort against the fog, and their hazy glow provided little by the way of illumination. I was therefore heartened to hear a familiar voice by my elbow. It was the voice of the great detective Erasmus Crane, who greeted me with a warmth that seemed somewhat out of place in the dull, melancholic drizzle of the freezing morning. Summoning me to follow, he calmly introduced another man who was standing beside him as a police detective by the name of Cooper. This Cooper was a large, mustachioed gentleman whose barrel chest seemed perfectly suited to his family name. He nodded in acknowledgment and led the way with the aid of his lamp down the narrow cobblestone alley and away from the main road. At length, we came to an intersection between three back streets, lit more clearly by an overhead gaslight and partitioned off by a thin stretch of rope that had been strung between the two walls, clearly with the intention of stopping the public, or any other interloper, from proceeding any further. Perceiving what lay just beyond that rope, however, I was convinced that this flimsy cord barrier actually served little purpose, since most men, upon catching even a glimpse of that grim tableau, would no doubt have turned heel in horror and raced in the opposite direction. Upon the ground, stretched out in a hideous flop of ragdoll contortions, was what remained of a young woman. She had evidently been not only killed, but butchered. Stripped of her clothes, which now lay in a tangled heap by her side, she had been slashed across the middle so that her innards, still slightly steaming in the cool of the morning, spilled out of her, only to have them been reorganized and placed in a carefully deliberate arrangement. Just below the ribcage, two almond shapes, presumably meant to represent eyes, had been daubed in blood on either side of the meridian line. Below them, torn forcibly out through a single horizontal slit, the intestines had been cut into tubes of similar length and splayed out in a fanned shape so that they writhed below, curling downward in a spread of grasping tendrils. The overall effect was to make the lower torso appear like the dangling tentacles of some great cephalopod, a hideous, squirming octopus merged with a man. Below this careful arrangement, the rest of the intestines were scattered, seemingly at random, upon the floor. It was therefore a great surprise to me when Crane asked that I take out my notebook and sketch as precisely as possible the configurations of the discarded organs. For a moment I railed against the idea, but catching the glint in his eye, recognized immediately that, were the gruesome task not of the utmost importance, he would not have asked it of me. "Take for your bearing the top of the head, which has been positioned to face east. Consider the rest to be proceeding from right to left in a roughly horizontal pattern, and try as best you can to record accurately each twist and flicker of the alignment." I felt my stomach churn as I began at once to record the requested details. As I did, Crane spoke in low but clearly audible tones to the police detective. "I am much obliged to you, Detective, for contacting me regarding this matter, and I can guarantee that my involvement in this inquiry will be treated with the utmost discretion." Crane paused and then gestured toward the body with the bowl of his pipe. "You will see, of course, that the visible bruises on this young lady's inner thighs cover a wide palette of colours, from purples and greens to light brown. This is indicative that they were sustained at different times during encounters unrelated to this incident. Some are newer, whilst others are well over a week old. I would therefore suggest that this unfortunate girl was engaged in the oldest profession. I would furthermore suggest that you consult Madame Hindy's at the establishment on Grey Street. All of the females in her employ wear the same orchid-based perfume, sourced by the madam herself, and the victim is clearly wearing it. Perhaps in this manner she might be easily identified, and through enquiries in the surrounding buildings some information gained as to the identities of her more regular clientele. I hope you will take the trouble to ensure a proper burial for her." Cooper nodded that he would, and, pleased by the confirmation, Crane continued. "As we see her now, this is how her body was found? None other than yourself has entered the vicinity?" Cooper again nodded that this was the case, before asking as to the significance of the sketches I was tasked with making. "Perhaps nothing," replied Crane flatly. "Though I think it's prudent to record every detail that may prove useful in future." At this he shot me a knowing glance, enquiring without ever saying a word whether I had concluded my sketches. I nodded in the affirmative, and Crane accordingly thanked the detective, assuring him that he would be in touch if and when any conclusions were reached. He then turned to leave, pausing only to add a single note of assistance. "I believe that once the body has been thoroughly examined, it will be easy enough for you to link this incident back to the dozen or so animal mutilations I wrote to you of previously, and to other incidents. This connection will be confirmed beyond a doubt when your doctor comes to examine the victim's liver." Cooper looked back at the body of the victim and back at Crane. The lack of footprints in the blood around the body and the lack of stains upon Crane's boots confirmed even to my own meagre powers of deduction that he had neither approached nor examined the body. Clearly Cooper had arrived at the same conclusion, and indeed had conjured up the same question that I had been tempted to ask. "And what exactly do you suppose we'll find when examining the liver that would shed light on such a crime?" he asked, with not a small dose of vitriol in his voice. "You will find," said Crane, turning his back on the detective and proceeding at a brisk pace back toward the road, "the same thing you will have found with the others, that the liver is missing." Hours later, having arrived back at Norton Street and made some attempt to steady my nerves by taking the tea thoughtfully prepared for us by Mrs. Hatton, I was finally summoned to Crane's side for some explanation as to what was going on. Up until this point, I had been content to leave the man to his pursuits, having learnt over many years not to press and cajole him during one of his periods of focused concentration. I therefore resolved to retire to an armchair and watch from a respectful distance as Crane was taken up by one of those unmistakable whirlwinds of fascination and applied thought, during which he made calculations and deductions far beyond what would ever seem humanly possible. So it was that for several hours, whilst I worked to steady and calm myself in one corner of the study, Crane had by contrast moved around in a fit of feverish activity, drawing, it seemed every few minutes, another heavy tome from the shelves and leafing frantically through it, pausing only to examine with great care and the aid of a magnifying glass the sketches I had taken of that poor creature's scattered insides. Eventually he became still, sat up, straight-backed and rigid in a fashion that I immediately recognized as a signal, a resolution. Some conclusion or confirmation, be it for better or ill, had been reached. After some moments, during which he never moved a muscle, he eventually leaned forward and, with something approaching reluctance, unlocked a drawer in his desk and opened it. From inside, he carefully removed 3 small shaving mirrors and what appeared to be yet another volume, this one carefully wrapped up in cloth. Having tentatively opened the book, he placed it carefully into a V-shaped wooden book cradle upon his writing desk. He then proceeded to fix one mirror by means of a thread tied to the lamp at an angle above the text. The second he placed before himself, the reflective surface facing away at a right angle to the first, and tilted so that it showed the image reflected in the first mirror. Finally, he placed the third across the desk, so that its surface was facing back toward the second mirror and towards him. Having completed the assembly of this strange construction, Crane sighed heavily. Leaning back in his chair, he lit his pipe and called me to his side. As he beckoned to me, he gave instructions before I got too close that I was only to look into the mirror and that I must not, at any cost, allow my eyes to fall upon the book that rested open upon his desk. Approaching slowly, I followed his instructions to the letter and saw immediately that the result of this strange construction was to show in the third mirror, upright before him, the reflection of a reflection of what had been written on the page. It was notable to me as I observed his actions, the reluctance with which Crane seemed to handle the volume he had taken from the drawer, manoeuvring it, almost at arm's length, with motions that teetered somewhere on the boundary between extreme care and absolute disgust. Looking into the mirror, I recognized at once my friend's own handwriting above what appeared to be an insensible mess of crazed lines and incoherent scribbling. Why, I thought, should Crane be so repulsed by something that had clearly been written by his own hand? "These are my own copied notes, taken in carefully arranged and illicit sittings at the British Museum from photographs of a very particular book. A volume so notorious that its very existence is regarded by many to be little more than a myth." He paused, and, craning his neck upward to avoid looking at the page, gently turned it with a pair of tweezers. "In fact, this volume is both very real and very dangerous. There are extant copies, rumoured to be stored in the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the Vatican, with a further 3 copies having found their way to the Americas. The text of which I speak, and from which these notes were taken, is none other than the fabled Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. How the villain has gained access to this text or to parts of it we may never know. I have heard it rumoured that in some clandestine quarters the text is preserved by having individual pages of the script tattooed onto the backs of children, and that these infants are then smuggled to various points across the globe for dedicated scribes to copy the text from. What we can be sure of is that whoever this individual is, he clearly has viewed the book or some portion of it, which in itself makes him a dangerous adversary. It is difficult for me to overstate to you just how foul and wicked a book this volume is, so insidious, in fact, that to view the names it contains in a printed form directly would be to risk madness, whilst to read those monikers aloud is to conjure things of which even madness cannot conceive. This configuration," he motioned toward the arrangement of mirrors, "allows us several degrees of separation from the printed word and the text itself. This incident, however, threatens to draw us far closer than ever we should be." Saying this, he held up the sketches I had made of the spilt entrails for me to examine. Holding them beside the mirror, he invited me to see the comparisons he had highlighted between the patterns on one and those on the other. It was an undeniable fact that they were a very close match, every curve and bend in the seemingly random strewing of organs marrying up with the ink-scrawled lines of what appeared, upon second viewing, to be some form of grotesque language. "What in God's name is it, Crane?" I asked, horrified by the similarities. "Careful, my friend. You are closer to the truth with your exclamations than you know." Shifting in his chair and turning toward me, though never quite allowing himself to offer his back to the volume, he knocked out the tobacco of his pipe roughly onto the desk. "We are spared any detrimental effects in the viewing by the crude nature of the artist's medium. It is impossible, using the materials the murderer had." By this I took him to mean the entrails that the fiend had deliberately manipulated to form something approaching words. "To replicate the subtleties of the written text exactly. The diacritics and swirling flourishes would be impossible to replicate in this form, but it is a good enough approximation for it to be identifiable, and worryingly, for it also to be effective." I looked from the parallel scripts, one sketched in pencil by my own hand, the other more detailed and in ink by Crane, and thought back to how I had first seen it, in the stinking damp of that alleyway. Crane went on. "In ancient Rome, Greece, and in both the Hittite and Etruscan traditions, there existed within the spiritual practices of the people a process of divination, which we now refer to as haruspicy, a form of extispicy. Essentially, this is a process for interpreting messages from the gods through examination of the entrails of sacrificed animals. In these traditions, the haruspex, that is, the person in charge of interpreting the signs, would examine the innards, particularly the livers and other organs, of a sacrificed animal, usually a goat or lamb, and read within its shape, contours, and markings messages from the gods. Omens, portents, and predictions of future events were all thought to come from such processes. The practice was widespread in the ancient Near East and was held in high regard. In fact, there are clay models of lambs' livers relating to such rituals in the collections of the British Museum. Those artifacts date back to 1900 BC and the kingdoms of Babylon, the ruins of which were supposedly visited by Alhazred himself. You think that this murder is some warped version of this ritual? That is why you assumed that the liver would be missing, I gasped. Crane nodded. In part, though there is more to it than that. As you are aware, I am a man who, within his own scope of interest, likes to remain well informed. To that end, I have a reliable network of informants and acquaintances ready to alert me of particular goings-on within the city. One phenomenon that I am very keen to keep abreast of, maudlin as it may seem, is the killing of domestic animals. Not slaughter for meat in the butchers and abattoirs, but any killings of dogs, cats, rodents, and swine that seem to go beyond the most basic pest control. In my experience, a rise in such incidents is often a harbinger of worse to come, and correlates directly with a rise in attacks on human beings. Almost a full year ago, I was informed by a city rat-catcher and 2 paperboys in my employ of animals that had not only been killed, but butchered in a very particular way. Whilst I was not able to examine these carcasses first-hand, the descriptions given to me by my informants match almost precisely the details you witnessed for yourself earlier today. I made it my business to keep the constabulary informed of my suspicions, and even went to the lengths of consulting Cooper on the matter, explaining why I suspected that very soon there could be a human victim killed in just such a manner. He was predictably dismissive and insisted that the constabulary was there to solve crimes that had happened, not those that gentlemen such as myself supposed might happen at some indeterminate point in the future. Having reminded him that the constabulary's aim was in fact to prevent crime, I also made him swear that if such an incident did occur, he would let me know. I mistakenly believed that a mild acquaintance with my reputation as a detective and a close acquaintance with a few coins of the realm might be enough to pry such an oath from him, and indeed he did give me his word. Yet it was an oath that he happily and foolishly neglected to keep until this morning. There have been 5 others. 5 victims killed in this similar fashion over the past 6 months. For 6 months, Cooper and his ilk have fumbled dangerously and incompetently at the evidence like a troop of orangutans armed with pistols. In their haste and secrecy, they have destroyed and corrupted important evidence and details that, had they been shared, might have enabled us to prevent further casualties. As things stand, it is only the pressure he has suffered on account of his men's evident lack of progress that has forced him to seek outside assistance, and even then only on condition that my involvement be masked with the utmost secrecy. I was finally afforded the chance to examine a body prior to his team's meddling at the incident upon which you also attended. I am sad to say that my observations have confirmed my earlier suspicions, but I'm also glad that it has perhaps provided us with an opportunity to end this horror. It is now beyond a doubt that these murders do not simply represent acts of random violence, crimes of passion, or obsession, but are rather the performance of carefully considered ritualistic sacrifice, offerings to a priest, himself of proportions almost beyond imagining, who is but a servant to older and far more terrible gods. My head was, of course, filled with questions, foremost amongst them being how my friend who had, until this point, shown himself to be of the most rational species of skeptic, could accept such notions as true. When I opened my mouth to ask, however, I found that the questions jostled and fought, clambering over one another in desperation to emerge and preventing any one individual from escaping through the aperture. Crane, noting my confusion, sat back and tried as best he could to explain. "The words you have seen formed from flesh, taken from that damnable book, are in fact names, Edwards. filthy, forbidden, and half-forgotten names of things that lurk beyond the veil of this reality. By repeating them, forming them in such a fashion, is making an offering in the hope of receiving an answer. He does so in the full and firm belief that such actions will grant him the boon of a message formed upon the liver of the victim. The victim is the sacrifice, the written name is the entity being consulted, and the liver— Here Crane swallowed hard, and for a flickering instant seemed to hesitate with what, had I not known better, I might have described as a look of fear upon his face. The liver is the thing's response. The first point of note from today's scene is the name itself. Whilst I held no desire to see this monstrosity written down, it has allowed me, through reference to my previous studies, to identify the entity to which this misguided supplicant is calling. We can see not only who, or what, he wishes to call unto, but what answer he hopes to receive, for as well as providing information and warnings about these entities and detailing the offerings that can be used to please them, the Kitab al-Azif, that is the Necronomicon, also contains spells that equate specific entities with what they might provide to their worshippers. Some promise power, some gold, some only the false promise of mercy when, with horrible inevitability, these old ones return to claim this world. In the case of the thing appeased by this haruspex, the reward seems to be the power of resurrection, the ability, by some strange right, to bring back from the dead those who have already passed. Whoever this criminal might be, his intention in this meddling is to bring someone back from beyond the veil. For a moment I considered saying that this was impossible, only to chasten myself at the thought of how the multitudes gathered in church for services each Sunday morning might react to such an affirmation. Noting my hesitance, Crane nodded solemnly. "You have, Edwards, always known me to be a man of a calm and rational mind. I am not one prone to flights of fancy, nor have I ever failed to scrutinize any and all propositions and circumstances with a necessary level of cynicism. You will, I trust, therefore, take me at my word when I tell you that when men disregard considerations of what should be done in favor of what could, such feats as these and worse are more than possible. The question is not whether this fiend can raise the dead, but rather at what price. This, Edwards, is a far greater peril than even the murders themselves might suggest, for in opening lines of communication between this realm and the other, the seeker creates a conduit, a pathway through which things far more threatening than messages could travel. With every call upon the name of this wretched thing, and every sacrifice offered to it, it gains in strength, and the aperture, the gateway between our worlds, grows larger. This haruspex must be stopped, and soon, not only for the sake of his potential victims, but for all our sakes." "But how?" I asked. "Are we to identify the villain with almost nothing to go on?" Here Crane finally relaxed back into a more familiar pose. "On the contrary, my dear Edwards, with the information the killer has provided us through his deeds, we are now far closer to apprehending him." Saying this, he suddenly sprang up from his seat and, flipping open his pocket-watch, marched toward the coat-stand by the door. "It is now 1:15 noon. On these winter days the sun will set at around 4 p.m. Meet me on the steps of the British Library at 5 p.m. By then I hope to have an answer." So it was that for the remainder of the day I felt within my breast as if some cursed tug-of-war were taking place. On the one hand I wished the hours away, looking forward in hope that some resolution might be found that would prevent catastrophe and any further pain. Yet, on the other, I also experienced the pull of trepidation, as with every passing moment I felt a creeping fear come upon me as the fateful hour approached. Finally, the moment arrived, and, as promised, Crane met me on the steps of that great institution, and with a wave of his hand beckoned me inside. Passing through the catalogues, the shelves of books, and the inquiry desk, Crane led me to a small nook between the stacks, where on a small desk by the window, lighted by the sombre glow of a single desk lamp, he had arranged a Stonehenge formation of volumes. These tomes were separated into 5 distinct stacks. Here, Edwards, are the texts pertaining to necromancy, magic, and the resurrection of the dead by means of witchcraft, which, according to their date stamps, were loaned from the library for an extended period within the last year. There is nothing in any of these books concerning the rotten branch of lore and legend with which our friend is tampering. However, it is not too much to suggest that before resorting to such extreme measures, he may first have dabbled in less extreme forms of the dark arts in an effort to achieve his aims. Now look closely. Taking 3 or 4 volumes from one of the piles, Crane opened each in a spread before him, then with his index finger pointed to the upper right-hand corners of the right-hand pages. Many of these volumes are of considerable age, the paper dried by the breath of decades. Such age makes the paper onto which the words are printed fragile. What you see here, he pointed to each of the spread volumes in turn. On these marked pages are slight breaks, hairline tears and creases in the texture of the paper. Now, reaching into his bag, he produced a small compact powder case of the type that a lady might use to store makeup. He then produced a brush and proceeded to dust the top corners of the page with a fine, dark powder. Whilst there had been cases, one notable example in Argentina, in which identification was made by means of matching fingerprints to the culprit, that science was at this time in its infancy. This, however, did not stop my friend from identifying that fingerprints and smudges were present. The grease and acids in our fingers can slightly damage paper of such age, and indeed leave marks that, whilst not entirely visible to the naked eye, can be seen with a slight dusting of a reactive powder. The prints, as you will see, are in similar points to the small breaks in the paper. Can you reason what might be curious about the placement of these prints and imperfections? "Left-handed," I answered almost immediately. The reader had turned the page from the top right-hand corner, a pattern common in left-handed readers, but had done so with some haste and slightly damaged the book. Crane regarded me closely and treated me to the first smile shared between us since the entire affair began. "Very good, Edwards. To be clear, I began by searching all of the books that referred to the topics in question. I narrowed that down to those taken from the library in the past year, which shrank the number considerably, and then examined each tome to single out volumes which showed recent use by a reader who happened to be left-handed. The books in this pile, all 9 of them, fit those parameters. I introduced the last variables on account of my observations this morning. When looking at the wretched tentacled face that the culprit made of the girl's innards, did you happen to notice how the mock tentacles had been cut? I shook my head to show that I had not. They had been slashed with a sharp instrument from top right to bottom left in a diagonal slash, as if the perpetrator was holding each bloody tube in his right hand because he was handling the instrument with his dominant left hand. Whilst I pointed out the bruises on the girl's thighs and how their discoloration indicated her profession, I did not mention those newer red and purple bruises on her wrists and throat, the deeper bruises of the wrist being again on the left-hand side, whilst the marks on the throat showed clearly that someone had closed their hand around the girl's windpipe, the placement of the thumbprint showing again that this was done by someone who was predominantly left-handed. Since we are looking for a left-handed killer, I thought it worth looking for a left-handed reader. Now, if you would be so kind, I would ask a small favour from you." Arriving as requested at the inquiry desk, I presented the librarian, a portly old gentleman with spectacles that rested so far down his nose that they seemed destined to tumble off at any moment, with the list of volumes that Crane had given to me, and, as per his instructions, reminded the old fellow that I was in need of those exact editions. The librarian regarded the list with a look of concern. "You say that it must be these specific editions?" I nodded, authoritatively trying to communicate through my expression the words, "those and those only." Clearly the expression was successful, as with a heavy sigh the librarian came around from his desk and began walking in the direction of the shelves. "I must say, sir, that your research takes you into some rather neglected corners. I dare say some of these editions have not been looked at for nearly a decade. You are certain that it needs to be—" I again gave him the expression. "Very well, though I should warn you that it may take some time for me to locate them all. Perhaps you had better take a seat here whilst I try to retrieve them for you." Glancing back toward the desk, I saw Crane slipping deftly behind it, and assured the old man, with a nod, that I was in no rush. "Take as much time as you need," I added merrily. After around 30 minutes, during which time the librarian had not once reappeared, Crane was at my elbow and urging me to my feet. Leaving the librarian still searching for the first of the listed volumes, one which Crane later informed me he had taken the trouble to deliberately misplace earlier that day, we rushed hurriedly for the door and out into what was now a pitch blackness that huddled beneath a blanket of thick London fog. Hailing a hansom, Crane clambered aboard and gave the driver orders for an address I had never heard him mention before. He also instructed the driver not to spare the horses in getting us there as quickly as possible. When the driver protested that the fog would make driving at speed difficult, Crane greased the wheels with the offer of a generous donation, and, soon enough, we were hurtling quickly and, it seemed to me, perilously along the narrow, cobbled streets. As we jerked heavily around another corner, Crane holding onto the window frame to steady himself, he began breathlessly to explain. "Whilst you were occupying the librarian," he began, shouting over the clacking racket of horseshoes on stone, "I sifted through the records to find who had loaned those particular volumes. Having found the name, I realized at once that it was one I recognized. Lord Arthur Turton loaned all 9 of those books. He is our left-handed reader, and perhaps our left-handed killer. Sir Arthur, you may remember, was the subject of a number of news stories early last year, when his wife Mallory, daughter Jessica, and their driver were tragically killed in an accident involving a hansom cab. Fearing that we might well meet a similar end, I gripped firmly to the leather strap that hung by the window of the cab and tried as I might to maintain my balance, as the cab jerked and veered wildly from side to side with every bump. Lord Arthur's wife and daughter were taken from him just over 1 year ago. In the time since, he has become somewhat of a recluse, retiring from society and only emerging to visit the library and, if I'm right, to commit acts of unspeakable savagery. I have the address, taken from those records, but we must hurry as I fear there is a further, even more sinister twist to this tale." Crane's flow was interrupted by an almighty jolt that rocked him forwards as the hansom hit some obstacle and one side rose up violently before righting itself and regaining its equilibrium. "At first," Crane shouted, his hair flying into his face with the force of the wind and speed at which we were hurtling forward, "I reasoned that Sir Arthur was the perfect suspect whose motivations were clear. He was a desperate man in mourning, driven by grief and anguish to the most wicked of ends in a bid to lift from the grave his beloved wife and daughter." From the brief outline Crane had provided, this certainly seemed the most likely scenario, and whilst nothing could justify the murder and mutilation of those young women, one could at least construct a chain of logic, lay the stepstones and follow the man's path into the darkness. As I was to find out, however, this was not the extent of Crane's discoveries. "That was only at first. There is an obvious problem. If Sir Arthur's crimes were, to his eyes, necessary offerings, a means by which to gain an answer, the rites and procedures needed to resurrect his wife and child, then why was he compelled to repeat the act, to kill multiple times? If he received his answer, if he was successful in resurrecting his beloved, then why should it be necessary to kill again? It could not be as simple as failure, for if the first attempt did not work despite the best efforts of the Haruspecs, then would not he have been discouraged from repeating so despicable an act? No, Edwards, there is another reason." As Crane pronounced the final word, the cab came to an abrupt stop. Both he and I jerked forwards, but whilst I then struggled to regain my balance, Crane used the forward inertia to spring from the carriage with an agility that never failed to surprise me. Having joined him on the road, I was led by way of an alley, eerily similar to the one we had visited that morning, around to the back of a large and clearly well-maintained townhouse. Slowing slightly, Crane eventually came to crouch by the cellar doors of the building. These wooden doors, at a horizontal slant at around ankle level, were presumably used by tradesmen and coal merchants to offload their wares and, when opened, led down by means of stone steps or a rampway into the basement of the house. As I watched, fascinated, Crane quietly unscrewed the top of his walking cane, a cane from which, on previous excursions, I had seen him draw a thin rapier sword that he kept concealed within the hollow length of the instrument. On this occasion, however, he dislodged from the detachable handle of the piece a small metal key, curiously bent so that it resembled a hair clip with two prongs. With lightning dexterity, he used this instrument, working it in swift, jerking motions into the keyhole, to quickly dispose of the padlock holding the shutter doors closed. He then lifted one of the doors and pressed his index finger to his lips to signify that I should remain silent. When first Crane flung back that door, I had wondered how we would enter without the aid of a lamp. Now I saw that a small amber glow, as of candlelight, enough indeed to assist our descent, was escaping from somewhere below. I reflected that, whilst this would make our entrance easier, it also increased the likelihood that this subterranean lair was currently occupied. Cautiously, and with movements that were almost feline in their stealth, Crane descended the stone steps into the cellar and waved a hand for me to follow. Whilst there was indeed a small glow coming from the wick of a single candle, much of the stone room remained immersed in darkness so thick that it seemed almost to have been painted on. What little light there was, however, remained sufficient for us to make out the dimensions of the room and what was held within the glow of the candle. It took but a second's glance to see that this was indeed the site of some strange endeavour, a notion reinforced by the etching upon the floor of strange geometric patterns, lines and stars enclosed in circles that were framed at strategic points with the same disgusting scrawl I had seen copied into Crane's notebook. In the centre of the room, resting before the candle and raised onto a plinth, was a pile of what looked to be sheets of aged vellum, stained with similarly warped calligraphy. At the top of this plinth was a statue, a squatting effigy of perhaps 30 centimetres in height. It was carved, it seemed to me, from some precious stone, opal or jade, and depicted in its hideous dimensions a figure that, whilst it retained the limbs and general proportions of a man, was in fact nothing of the sort. Catching sight of the thing's monstrous head, of the rippling knot of cephalopodic appendages that writhed in tangles from beneath its sloped forehead, and which comprised much of the lower portion of its face, I realized immediately that the mangled form was familiar. I had seen it before, seen its hateful outline sketched in a rudimentary approximation upon the chest and stomach of that girl's pale form. For a moment I felt a wave of nausea fold around me, and perhaps I would have vomited had I not been startled to a state of panicked alarm by a sound coming from the darkened corner of the room. For a moment we both remained in silence, staring into the wall of black that hunched beyond the boundary from which the candlelight itself seemed to shrink and recoil, past which no form or outline was discernible, and yet from out of which a sound, wet, heavy, and pregnant with the sly hush of smiling malevolence, slithered and rose up for us to hear. An electric crackle like the sharpening caress of frost flashed across my head and nape, bringing every hair to attention. Beside me I could hear Crane's breath, steady and deliberate, as again, from the corner, came the sound as of something large but slick with moisture. Something crept out towards us. From some forgotten corner of my own mind, from some dark fathom never before visited and yet still undeniably there, shattered fragments of images began to rise, thoughts of things shifting in the depths with size and bulk of such enormity that their movements could alter the course of the tides. I thought again of great kings and older gods, of tentacles and the bitter cold of their texture, chill as long-dead flesh. I thought at once of frigid, rubbery, and boneless slack that one might feel were such tentacles to reach and fasten around an arm, or if, From out the black of night, the conical tip of such a succored form should subtly graze, but with a whispered caress, the skin of the lips as you roused yourself from sleep. I will confess that my first instinct was to run, to hurl myself headlong back up the stone steps, out of the cellar and into the familiar damp of the London night. Yet even this retreat was rendered impossible as my limbs refused to obey my wishes, remaining instead listless and watery, uselessly fixed by fear to the very centre of the room. Glancing to my right, I turned my head just in time to see Crane marching boldly forwards as he disappeared into the black. For a long time there was silence, an awful vacant blank of sight and sound that struck my heart with the deepest panic, until, from out of the dark, Crane once again emerged, dragging behind him by means of a hand fastened onto the wrist the milk-white form of a half-naked man. Imploring me to help, Crane grasped the corpse-like figure, seemingly more liquid than flesh, and heaved him bodily into the light. Never in my life have I seen such a pitiful form, a thing no longer a man, but a mocking, half-done imitation of life. The man, if he could be blessed with such a title, sported a large black beard, shot all over with flecks of white. The eyes were swollen shut, whilst the mouth, a black cavern from which the teeth, some snapped in half, had almost entirely been removed, gaped and splayed, soundless and tongueless, behind cracked lips that had not tasted water for what looked to be many days. The cheeks, testament to a starved emaciation of their owner, were sunken to such an extent that the skin curved in a convex arch inward from the bone, like the tattered remnants of sail fixed to a broken mast. The cuts, burns, and various other offences that covered the skin were obvious even from the first, and, as he writhed blind and open-mouthed upon the floor, he more closely resembled a worm than any human I had ever seen. As I stood, impotently frozen and fixed to the spot with terror, Crane released his grip, allowing the man to flop heavily onto the stone floor. Then, as the thing mewled and screeched, nodding over and over its pitiful excuse for a head, as if in affirmation, Crane drew the sheath from off his cane and removed the sword that had rested inside. As I lurched forward, imploring him to stop, he raised the blade above his head, clutching the shaft with both hands, and in a single downward thrust drove the steel point into the thing's throat, skewering it such that the tip of the blade scraped and clanked against the stone floor. Then, with a final wrenching twist, he finished the deed. The thing twitched, then fell silent. Looking at it, still and twisted in a mangled heap on the floor, it was apparent almost immediately that this was, or at least at some time had been, simply a man. Retrieving the blade, Crane turned and, ripping the candle from its place, held it aloft, lighting areas of the room previously concealed. Upon the walls, piled upon the shelves and hanging from hooks, was such a collection of instruments, iron pliers, scissors, pokers, and strange pointed objects, that at first I considered that the space might have been used for some kind of ironworks, or been the site of some barbarically primitive surgery. It was only as I saw the chair, affixed with its straps and chains, that the true horror of the scene began to come to me.
"When I found Sir Arthur's name at the library,"
Crane uttered, breathlessly, from behind me,
"I also looked at his other loans, the other texts he had requested and pursued. All of them, barring those relevant to magic, focused upon the topic of torture. Histories, techniques, and instruments. It seems Sir Arthur was driven not so much by grief, but by vengeance."
I looked again at the fleshy carcass prostrate on the floor, at the vicious and numerous horrifying injuries it had sustained, before Crane had, perhaps mercifully, put an end to its agony.
"Sir Arthur succeeded in bringing someone back, but it was not his wife or daughter. He had no interest in raising his loved ones, but instead resurrected the man who had taken them from him, the driver of the cab that had overturned, the man who had also been killed in the accident. Killed, that is, for the first time. With the help of things that should never be spoken of, Sir Arthur raised him, killed him, and raised him again, over and over, for months, no doubt to the delight of those who provided assistance. The many sacrifices, the need for new guidance, etched upon the organs of the innocent, was a way of ensuring that the filthy deed could continue. Death, torture, and rebirth again and again until Sir Arthur had slaked his thirst for retribution, or perhaps, more likely, indefinitely.
As Crane spoke, I was astonished to see that the cadaver at his feet had already begun to decompose. Its contours slid, as if melting, toward the ground in a manner that conjured for me the final lines of that tale by Mr. Poe, in which he speaks of a nearly liquid mess of loathsome, detestable putridity.
With every murder, with every resurrection and recitation of those unholy names, the things on the other side grew stronger, urging Sir Arthur on to ever more loathsome and violent ends, to continue with deeds that would fatten and strengthen them. I only pray that we have intervened in time. I hope you see, Edwards, that what I killed was not a man of this earth, that it had no business here, and that in ending its suffering I was providing a mercy, allowing it to return at last from whence it came, to sleep undisturbed, as we most hope the old ones also shall.
I could do little more than nod. Within the space of 2 hours, Sir Arthur had been arrested. As we had ridden toward the constabulary, Crane had explained to me that a stringent requirement in the performance of such rituals is that the adept commit to paper, in detail, the stages and actions he undertook as he performed them. This, he assured me, was a characteristic of much ritual magic, and was intended to ensure that the prospective conjurer was fully aware and cognizant of their actions as they performed them, that they had reflected upon the horrors they committed, or were required to commit, at each stage. In some traditions, this process acted as a breadcrumb trail, allowing the sorcerer to find his way back through the stages he had completed, to turn back and retrace his steps at any stage in the process. In some traditions, it was intended to chasten the adept, to make them consider and discourage them from venturing any further. In this most evil of traditions, however, it served to encourage, to spur the practitioner on, goading and needling them to revel and delight in the ecstasy of their misdeeds, all to feed and satiate the appetites of their masters. In either case, just as Crane had predicted, such records had indeed been kept by Sir Arthur and were found amongst his papers. These accounts, as they pertained to the murders, were detailed enough in the eyes of the law to constitute a confession. The portions of the text relating to resurrections and acts of torture, conjurations, and strange gods were omitted from the court documents after they were deemed to be the deluded ravings of a diseased mind. Sir Arthur escaped the hangman on grounds of insanity, and was committed instead to the Seward Sanatorium. After all, by the time the police arrived, all traces of the man who was supposedly brought back had vanished. I must say that I often wish that the memories of that night would proceed with them, to be forever forgotten, into the darkness of the void. This has been Erasmus Crane and the Cthulhu Murders, a short horror story, written by Michael Vandervoort, narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2023 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.